Every other ancient superpower disappeared. Egypt fell, Rome fell, Babylon turned to dust. But one civilization never actually died. It collapsed, again and again. Invaders conquered its capital. Foreign armies sat on its throne. Its language nearly vanished under occupation. And yet, 3,000 years later, it is still here. Still speaking a version of the same language. Still ruled from the same river valleys. Still calling itself by the same name. How is that possible? How does a civilization survive its own destruction over and over for 3,000 years? This is the story of China. Not just a country, a pattern that refuses to break. To understand it, we need to ask a stranger question first. Why do conquerors who defeat China always end up becoming Chinese? Mongols conquered it. Manchus conquered it. Warlords tore it apart from the inside. Every single time, something strange happened. The conquerors changed more than China did. Keep that question in your mind. We'll come back to it, because the answer explains something much bigger than history. It explains why China survived colonization attempts that destroyed other empires. It explains why China rebuilt itself after near total collapse. And it explains why, today, the world is once again organizing itself around this one country. To understand any of that, we have to go back to the beginning. Long before empires, long before writing, long before the word China existed. Around 2000 BCE, along the Yellow River, small farming communities began to grow. Historians call the earliest of these the Qing Dynasty. Some of it is legend, some of it is fact. The line between them is still debated. But what came next is not in doubt. The Qing Dynasty rose around 1600 BC. They built walled cities. They cast enormous bronze vessels. They carved questions into turtle shells and ox bones, then read the cracks like messages from the gods. Those cracked bones hold the earliest Chinese writing ever found. That detail matters more than it sounds, because that writing system never disappeared. It evolved. It spread. It is still used today, thousands of years later. Most ancient scripts died with their empires. This one didn't. And that single fact becomes the first clue to the mystery. Writing gave China something almost no other civilization had. A shared identity that outlived any single dynasty. Kingdoms could fall. The language stayed. Around 1046 BCE, the Zhou dynasty overthrew the Qing. They needed a justification for taking power by force. So they invented one. They claimed heaven itself had withdrawn its blessing from the old rulers. This idea became known as the Mandate of Heaven. It sounds simple. It wasn't, because it created a rule that would shape China for the next 3,000 years. A ruler only stays in power as long as heaven approves. Natural disasters, famine, and rebellion were read as signs that approval had been withdrawn. In other words, China invented a built-in excuse for revolution. Dynasties could fall, but the system for replacing them never had to change. This is the first advantage. Not a wall, not an army, an idea. But an idea alone doesn't build an empire. By 500 BCE, the Zhou kings had lost real control. China fractured into competing states, locked in constant war. Historians call it the Warring States period. It was brutal, but brutal periods force innovation. Iron weapons replaced bronze. Armies grew into the hundreds of thousands. And philosophers wandered from court to court, trying to answer one urgent question. How do you hold a fractured civilization together? Confucius answered with order, duty, and hierarchy. Legalist thinkers answered with strict law and harsh punishment. These arguments never really ended. They just kept resurfacing. Then, in 221 BCE, one state won. Qin Shi Huang crushed his rivals and declared himself the first emperor of a unified China. He standardized the writing script. He standardized currency. He standardized the width of card axles, so roads could connect the whole empire. He also began linking together defensive walls in the north. Centuries later, those walls would be extended and rebuilt into the structure we now call the Great Wall. For the first time, China existed as a single political idea. It should have been the beginning of a stable golden age. Instead, the Qing dynasty collapsed within 15 years. Qin Shi Huang ruled through terror. Forced labor built his roads, his walls, and his enormous tomb. When he died, rebellion tore the empire apart almost immediately. On paper, unification had failed, but something strange happened next. The dynasty that replaced it, the Han, did not undo unification. They kept it. They kept the standardized script. They kept the centralized bureaucracy. They kept the idea that China should be one connected civilization, not scattered kingdoms. The Qing had built the frame. The Han filled it with something that could last. This is where the pattern truly begins. China did not need a single unbroken government to survive. It needed a system that could be rebuilt again and again using the same blueprint. Dynasties were temporary. The blueprint wasn't. For the next several centuries, the Han Dynasty expanded China's territory, opened trade routes towards Central Asia, and built one of the most sophisticated bureaucracies in the ancient world. Government officials were chosen partly through exams testing classical texts, not just noble birth. That detail matters again. It meant Chinese identity was tied to shared education and shared writing, not to one bloodline or one ruling family. You didn't need to be born Chinese to become Chinese. You needed to write the script, study the texts, follow the customs. That single idea is about to become the key to the entire mystery. Because China's greatest threat was coming, not from inside its borders, from the vast grasslands to the north. For centuries, nomadic horse warriors raided China's frontier. Fast, mobile, and difficult to fight in open terrain. Then, in the 13th century, one of them united an army unlike anything the world had seen. Genghis Khan, his grandson Kublai Khan, finished the job his family started. By 1279, the Mongols had conquered all of China. For the first time in its history, the entire country was ruled by foreign invaders. This should have been the end of the story. The Mongol Empire was the largest land empire in human history. Chinese armies had been crushed. Chinese cities had been destroyed. Chinese emperors had been erased. If any conquest was going to permanently erase Chinese identity, this was it. But something unexpected happened. Kublai Khan didn't just rule China by force. He adopted a Chinese dynasty name, the Yuan. He used Chinese administrative systems. He settled into the same imperial rituals Chinese emperors had used for centuries. The conqueror was slowly becoming the conquered. Within less than a century, the Yuan dynasty collapsed, worn down by rebellion, and was replaced by a new Chinese dynasty, the Ming. The invaders were gone. The Chinese system remained. Why does this keep happening? Why do China's conquerors keep ending up ruling China on China's own terms? This is the mechanism at the center of everything. China's power was never only military. Its real power was cultural gravity. Whoever sat on the throne needed literate officials to run the country. Those officials came from the same schools, studying the same texts, writing the same script for 1,000 years. To govern China, you had to become part of its system. The system absorbed its conquerors instead of being erased by them. But the story wasn't finished. A bigger test was coming. In the 17th century, another outside force broke through China's defenses. This time from the northeast, the Manchu people. In 1644, they seized the capital and founded a new dynasty, the Qing. Once again, foreign rulers now sat on China's throne. And once again, the same pattern appeared. The Qing emperors studied Confucian texts. They preserved the imperial bureaucracy. They positioned themselves as legitimate holders of the mandate of heaven. Conquest by force. Legitimacy by absorption. By now, a clear rule had emerged. China doesn't defeat its conquerors on the battlefield. It outlasts them through its institutions. The Qing dynasty expanded China to its largest territorial size in history. For a moment, it looked like nothing could break this cycle. Then, in the 19th century, a threat arrived that the old mechanism was not built for. It didn't come on horseback. It came by sea. European powers, backed by industrial weapons and steamships, arrived demanding trade on their own terms. When China resisted, Britain went to war over the opium trade and won. The First Opium War ended in 1842. China was forced into unequal treaties, forced to surrender territory, forced to open ports it didn't want opened. This time, absorption didn't work. Foreign powers didn't want to become Chinese. They wanted resources, markets, and control. Defeat followed defeat. Rebellion followed rebellion. The imperial system that had survived for 2,000 years began to crack from every direction at once. Chinese historians call this era the Century of Humiliation. By 1912, the last imperial dynasty collapsed completely. For the first time in over 2,000 years, China had no emperor. It should have been the final ending. The mechanism, it seemed, had finally failed. Decades of civil war, invasion, and famine followed. Millions died. The country fractured into competing factions fighting for control. If ever there was a moment when China might disappear as a unified civilization, this was it. But the pattern was not finished yet. In 1949, after a brutal civil war, the Communist Party under Mao Zedong took control and declared a new People's Republic. Once again, out of collapse, a new centralized system rose to replace the old one. The dynasty was gone. The instinct toward unity remained. The transition was catastrophic in human cost. Political campaigns and famine killed tens of millions. This is not a footnote. It is central to understanding modern China, and historians still debate its full toll. But by the late 20th century, a new reversal began. Starting in 1978, China opened parts of its economy to markets and foreign investment. Hundreds of millions of people moved out of poverty in a few decades. Factories multiplied. Cities exploded outward. Trade routes that once carried silk now carried electronics, steel, and containers by the millions. The country that had been humiliated by industrial powers became one of the world's largest industrial powers itself. Once again, defeat had somehow become the foundation for the next rise. So now we can return to the original question. Why did China survive when every other ancient superpower disappeared? It wasn't military invincibility. China lost wars. Its capital fell more than once. It wasn't isolation. China was invaded, occupied, and ruled by outsiders repeatedly. The real answer is something quieter. China built a system so deeply tied to shared writing, shared bureaucracy, and shared identity that conquering a land was never the same as conquering the civilization. Rulers changed. Dynasties collapsed. Borders shifted for centuries. But the underlying blueprint kept getting reused generation after generation. We thought this was a story about an empire. It was actually a story about a system that could survive without any single empire at all. That is why, today, China is not just an old civilization sitting quietly in history books. It is once again one of the most powerful economies on Earth, at the center of global manufacturing, technology, and trade. The same question people asked 2,000 years ago is being asked again in boardrooms and governments today. How do you deal with a country that keeps getting rebuilt? Every other ancient superpower disappeared. China didn't. Not because it never fell, but because it always knew how to rise again, using pieces of the very system that had just collapsed. That is the real history of China. Not a straight line, a loop that kept refusing to break. And it is still spinning today,